Cool. Great. YouTube says I'm live. Cool. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Shared it with my team. Okay. Ready. Wait, no. Where's my camera? The heck? Oh no, my camera's missing. What the heck? Oh my goodness. Every day. There we go. Hello, hello. Happy March 21st. It is 9, well, almost 9 a.m. Thursday. Hope you're doing well. Today, we are going to be having a deep diving into checkboxes and radio components within HSDS React. Um, these are really interesting. So they they're very tiny components visually, but they do a lot of complex things. So if we take a look at which one is this one? Nope, checkbox. Uh, Actually, it's better to dive into the code here. Checkbox. All right. Where's my syntax highlighting? There we go. Yeah, you can see that there's not a lot of stuff going on. It's rendering a choice. And if I go into radio, there's also not a lot of things going on. It's also a choice. And this was intentional. This was a thing I kind of borrowed from Shopify's Polaris component library. And that is to have a single component that works as the underlying component to render either a checkbox or a radio. And the reason for this is because they more or less behave exactly the same. The UI they render is slightly different. And with checkboxes, you can check multiple, and with radios, you can only do one. That's the only difference, functionally speaking. So within the realm of React, there is this concept of controlled components. What that means is the best example is an input, where by default, the input has some, like I'm talking about, whoops, I'm talking about this, like that input, just a default React native component input. So by default, there is some sort of internal state going on. That's how it's able to like update itself and do all that kind of stuff. Maybe not exactly, but that concept of it at least. However, as soon as you give it a value, some value, then it becomes a controlled component because regardless of whatever it is you type in it, that value that's rendered within the DOM and the UI, it doesn't change because you're forcing it to have a specific value. The only way that you can change it is if you tap into this onChange callback of some kind, handle onChange, and then you, as the parent, the parent person component thing, so you as the parent person component thing, you have to manage handle onChange with some sort of state mechanism, whether that's context, whether that's internal component state, whether that's Redux or whatever it is you want, you have to manage that. And then once that data has been updated, it could be, in the case of input, it's typically just adding a single character for every keystroke you have. So anytime that changes, it then feeds back some value, which is now the updated value into input, and that input is then updated for every single character you type. And now input's control has been given over to whatever it is that's controlling the value and also what happens when the value changes. So that's the idea of a controlled component. And inputs, any kind of input, they're really good examples of that, especially if you're building like custom ones for a component library. If you're not doing that, then something's wrong. So yeah, checkboxes and radios, they are inputs. They're just the type is different. Type is checkbox or radio. So there is a very interesting decision here. So I could have done something like this where I um, modified the default um, input component within HSDS to accept either a radio or a checkbox type. I'm just going to confirm. I believe input type checkbox. I believe these are, yes, so you can have either radio or checkbox types. You could do that, and then the input would then render either radio or checkbox. But it it's much better, I think, if these were their own kind of components, because how we use inputs within HSDS React, they aren't necessarily a replacement for this. They are the thing designed to render some sort of UI like that where you're able to enter in text. That's what an input is within HSDS React. You can call them different names. They can be form fields, or in a la Bootstrap, they can be form controls, whatever it is. Inputs. I think inputs are simpler. So with that said, because input is its own thing, not radios and checkboxes, we need a checkbox component and also a radio component. Great. So now let's take a look at the checkboxes and radios. Like I showed earlier, I'm going to keep this little sketch pad here. So as I said earlier, they are using choice. So let us take a look at choice. And in terms of the age of these components, right now they're kind of so refactored. I can tell because there's flow here, there's some typing, and there's also some sort of namespacing mechanism here, which is great. They're not the latest and greatest stuff. They're not TypeScript or anything like that, but it's fine. Choice. This is where all the fun stuff is hidden. Choice. Here we go. Yeah, this is where all the logic is. Okay, so what is a choice? If I pull up the storybook, HSDS React, I don't know if I have choice components where you can see, but I can definitely show you a checkbox. Where'd it go? Checkbox. Here it is. Great. So I have a checkbox, and then I have some sort of label, and then I have some sort of help text. And with that checkbox, you can add any kind of custom content you want. They can be used within a group, so you can check multiple things. They can be disabled, and they can be stateful, where you have a orange one here for warning, success, or error. Great. So in radio is basically the same thing, just UIs are a little bit different. One very interesting thing though, I'm going to jump back to this default one. How this checkbox looks right here. This UI, it's very similar to Mac OS's native looking checkbox like this guy here. Oh crap, no. At least how they render within the web. They're almost identical. And this was by design. This is not the native Mac OS looking checkbox. This is CSS and stuff to make it look like that. And the reason for that is this is the UI that we want consistent across all browsers and all operating systems. To make it look like the Mac OS-ish kind of checkbox with a double border and some shadow and a tick and so on. So yeah. So let's see what we can do to make this happen. Okay, there are a bunch of, oh, there's a duplicate property. That's not cool. Let me just remove that. There are a bunch of things that you can do with this. You can change the alignment of how you want this, I believe how you want this guy to be aligned with all these guys. Let me just double check. Thank goodness for types. Types. Top. You can align it to the top or not. That's strange. I don't know why that's there. That's interesting. Autofocus. So yeah, it's basically toggling autofocus when you render the thing. Checked. This is the guy that I believe it mimics the default input HTML, where you do input type checkbox, and then you pass in the checked attribute, that's what that is. Component ID. This is like an internal choice-based mechanism that sets a unique ID when this is rendered. So there's a very interesting thing we have within HSDS React. It usually is available for anything that's form-based or anything that might require some sort of ARIA targeting based something. So if I inspect element on this guy, where is it? I'm looking for an ID. Oh boy. So we have a checkbox, we have an input. It should be on this input ID. Great. Checkbox 12. Cool. So it rendered an ID of checkbox 12, even though I didn't give it an ID within the story. All I did within the story is literally just this. So there is an internal mechanism, an ID mechanism within HSDS React. It's a utility that's available here. And you can see I borrowed this from Shopify. It creates a factory that caches an index number and outputs a function. And anytime that function gets called, that ID gets incremented by 1. So it's a guaranteed unique ID for that entire browsing session where all your components render into the DOM. Here we go. Here's this unique ID little guy going on right here. And for choice, we are able, so how it works is you'll have some sort of prefix. So by default, we'll have like the first one will be, I believe, choice 1. And then you have choice 2, choice 3, choice 4, and so on. Right. And I believe with this component ID, you can change what this prefix is. And instead of choice, checkbox should be checkbox, radio should be radio. And anytime one of those suckers renders into the UI, they will have guaranteed unique IDs. And that's good, especially for forms. Any kind of form-based thing, you want unique IDs for those guys. And this thing handles it for you because you don't have to, then you don't have to think about it. Help text. Help text is basically this little guy that renders down there, and I'll kind of show you the component that renders that in a little bit. Kind. Kind, I believe, is a thing that determines whether it's a checkbox or a radio. Nope, type is the one that determines whether it's a checkbox or a radio. That makes sense. So what on earth does kind do? So as you can see, it's been a while since I've worked in this bit of code, but that's okay. We can explore this together. And it'll kind of show me what kind of gaps there might be. Kind is something stacked. Let's check the story. Input, no, checkbox stories, kind. Huh. So right now, kind is a mystery for me. There has to be some reason. Maybe it's being passed into the input component. Kind? This is where typing would have been handy. Or documentation. Documentation? It's not in my docs. Why is it even there? I think, I may be wrong, but I think during my refactor, kind should have been type. Like these were the same. So now this is some sort of lingering thing from the refactor. We probably don't need it anymore. So I'm just going to go with that. Kind is supposed to be type, and type is the thing that determines whether it's a checkbox or a radio. Cool. Stacked. Stacked is a property that renders things slightly differently, and we can check it out right here. Option tile? Nope. Option icon? Nope. Radio card. There are a lot of components, guys. There's over 100 components within HSDS React. Fun fact, radio card, yes. So in order for you to render some sort of UI that looks like this, we need to add the stacked flag to it, so it's able to stack on top of something else. Yeah, so these components are really cool. You can use them in isolation, or you can use them with other things to create bigger pieces of UI like this. This is something that we use within Beacon. And all the keyboard stuff works as you'd expect, left to right and so on. That's because the types are specified so that the browser understands how to work with them from a keyboard perspective. So I didn't actually add any keyboard handling for this. It's just native browser input checkboxes and radios, and that's just how they work, which is great. Because okay, pro tip: leverage that kind of stuff anytime you can. Anytime you can avoid trying to rig up some sort of keyboard logic, go with that solution. So a really good example is the switch mechanism, or the switch component right here. So switch, internally, it uses a input. So because of that, that's how you're able to support tabbing and pressing a enter or space to toggle the thing. That's just because it's a checkbox internally. That's it. I mean, switches are checkboxes. They just look fancier. That's all. Excuse me. State is a thing that determines whether it's red, yellow, or green. Type is checkbox or radio, and value is whatever value you give it. Great. So now we know our props, and we have some default props, which is cool. We no longer need to do this. So I learned later on, a couple months ago, where I thought that in order for you to map your props to your state in this kind of format, you needed to use the constructor if you're using, if you have a class-based component, which you will, because if you have state, then you have a class-based component. Unless you're using hooks, it's a different discussion. So you actually don't need to do that anymore. You can just do this, depending on the Babel plugin and stuff you have, or if you're using TypeScript and so on. But you can just do this, assuming you have a more modern setup, which is cool. And also, if you happen to need a constructor like this for whatever reason, there are actually two arguments that the constructor gets. One is props, the other one is context. So I made a new mistake here where you should be passing both to super like that. One thing that I've seen done is to do something like this, which does the same thing. However, now that you don't have props here, you can't do this mapping thing. And also, if you have types, or you need to pass it like that. So up to you, depending on your system and your needs. But ideally, you want to pass both props and context into your Superman. So here, right here, this is the control mechanism that we talked about earlier. The component, the choice component, or input, or whatever it is, the controllable component, it has internal state. So its internal state is checked, which can be defined by the user if you provide it with something. And anytime it changes the checked thing, we have this handle on change. It'll set the internal state for it, and then it'll broadcast the value that has been changed. If you choose to subscribe to this component. Oh, by the way, if you're building things like checkboxes, inputs, and stuff, please give them, please pass through properties like on change, things you expect forms to have. That way, the user consuming them, or the person constructing larger components using these smaller bits, they can just use them as if they were inputs and low-level things without having to look through docs and think about things. So yes, try to make your things as intuitive as possible. So this is what I mean by like when you code things and design things in an intuitive way, where people can just use it without reading documentation, and it should more or less work most of the time. they can intuit how it's supposed to work. So this is the controlling mechanism. This is the on-change mechanism that changes the internal state. And this is where the point of control gets handed over to the consuming component or the user, where it'll pay attention to prop changes. And during a prop change, it will set this guy is the one that will control and set the state. So now this is the part where the control of the internal state gets handed over to the user. And these are the basic principles of how you would construct a controlled component. That's it. Looking at this now, we actually don't really need handle on blur. Actually, we might. So there are some fun things that's happening within choice. It has to do with It has to do with context. We'll get into that in a bit. Choice is a unique little guy. Cool. So here we're just rendering some sort of label. Looking at this now, I did a deep dive or a walkthrough in how we're supposed to refactor and think about slicing and refactoring React components. I would make a subcomponent here, call it choice label or something. And with that, I would give it some logic, and then it would render all this kind of stuff. That way, this kind of like logic here wouldn't have to live within choice. But yeah, all it does is giving it some CSS things and rendering a label and then rendering that text into the UI. That's all. Very interesting, very important thing within the HSDS ecosystem is anytime you want to render text of anytime you want to render text at all, always use one of the components to do it, whether it's label, help text, which is right here, which is a guy that I was going to talk about. So let me jump over to Checkbox. Just peeking over. No one's chatting in the live chat. It's fine. It's I do this for me and also for the fact that it's recorded afterwards. Yes, help text is that. It's basically makes it gray. That's all it does. We have text and we have help text and we have some other ones. Always use these guys to render your components. Or render text. The reason why is they have a lot of built-in internal things that ensure that the text that you're rendering looks uniform throughout the entire UI. Because the difference between something like this and something like this is that just from a styling standpoint, the word hello here is styled by this component, which has very specific styles to integrate either into the application or our embeddable guy, which is a beacon. Here, you're arbitrarily allowing the parent environment to style the text however it is they choose, which is fine if you have a relatively understandable and controlled CSS environment where you understand how fonts, colors, weights, families, and all that stuff is being handled. But oftentimes it's not the case. So by doing this, we have a guarantee of how that text is supposed to render given that particular environment. And there's also a bunch of other things that go on within text. Help text. Help text is basically an enhanced version of text. I believe it either shares the same properties or it renders text underneath. And all that does is that it makes the text gray. And all those colors of how text can be rendered. This is the last bit I'm going to talk about text. Text is like a whole nother thing. Have been specified within HSDS React. There are very specific shades that's available for text to render. That way our UI stays consistent. They're not just like randomly hard-coded hex codes. Visually hidden. This is a pattern I absorbed from Bootstrap. So you do Bootstrap, visually hidden, under accessibility. So this is good because if you do need to give your, I guess, in the context of choice, if you do need to hide the label for any kind of reason, the screen readers still need to be able to have access to it. Visually hidden, which is a component that basically does what this Bootstrap does, SR only thing does, hides it from the DOM, but makes it accessible for screen readers. That's what this is. And this is the thing I really like about creating these low-level components, because these are really, really important things to get right. And this kind of stuff is taken care of for the other developers and their users. They don't need to think about visually hiding labels or adding accessibility things into these low-level bits, because they've already been taken care of for you. All you got to do is use Checkbox and give it some sort of check mechanism if you want to control it. And that's all you got to do. IDs are automatically incremented and generated. Labels are already created for you. Accessibility has been taken care of for you. All that stuff is done. And all you got to do is implement it with this one-line interface. Very, very nice. Yeah, so I spent a little bit talking about labels, but labels are a very important part of how forms kind of work. Let me just see where this gets rendered. Get label markup. Label markup. Cool. So a very kind of conventional kind of workaround thing people do within HTML is they would wrap their controlled input thing with the label like that. This is very convenient because now that the input is within the label, you can add some label text like so, and now if you click on some label text like that, your input would be controlled, because as far as the DOM understands, like when you click on a label, the associated input with it will be controlled by it. That's just native HTML. However, for our purposes, we can't do that. They have to be separate because we have to offer the user some sort of flexibility in terms of how labels should appear and what kind of content should be provided to the dropdown. And maybe you want to provide your own labels that wraps the thing. I don't know. Like we have to give this a lot of flexibility. And that's where this hide label thing comes in. Hide label. Is if you want to use your own label, that's totally fine. You can do that. And so now that choice renders labels that are separate from the input, how does something like this work? Here. How does something like this work where when I click on that, the input still gets controlled? Basically, because this unique ID is generated on instantiation, we can use HTML4 unique ID, and then we have the ID here, unique ID. And that is how the label is able to control the input. Because a unique ID with our low-level create unique ID factory thing has done it for us when within the internals of choice. The label can control the input using HTML4. And that is why IDs are really important to get right. And that's why we have to have some sort of mechanism to ensure that they are unique. Okay. Help text, yeah, this just renders some help text input. This is the guy that renders the input, passing it a lot of properties. Wow, this is dumb. I need to clean this up. There's a little bit of cleanup. There's a little bit of duplication in here. It doesn't break. It's just like a little unfortunate to see. That's all. So I'm seeing some context prop stuff going on here. I will tell you what that's all about in a bit. But here we're just basically creating an input that passes it all the way down. Oh, what is this? It passes everything into a very specific choice input component that knows how to handle rendering the UI for this guy here. This is basically presentation. Wow, there's more duplication here. This is basically presentation stuff. It's just rendering the box with the ring on focus and also the color. The logic and stuff is provided to it by choice. So that's all the input does. Just double checking to see if there's no more duplication. Okay, it's fine. Okay, render time. Okay, we're just creating some classes. And this is the guy that's really interesting. Choice group context. What on earth is choice group context? This is using the new React 16 context API, where you create some sort of context instance somewhere, and it gives you both a provider and a consumer. And this basically is a component where you put stuff inside. By stuff, I mean other components in your application and so on. And you give it a value of something. It could be a string, it could be an object, it can be whatever. And then the context consumer is another component that leverages a render function that's able to pluck any value that you get here, like so. And now these context props are available to whatever component that you want to give it, so that you want to render inside. And this is a very kind of declarative way of how you can pass properties between the provider and the consumer, like so. Yeah, that's all it is. A nicer, tidier way of doing the passing of context. So that's what we got going on here. We have some sort of context consumer that renders the choice stuff. And for this input that gets rendered, this little guy here, it needs to be adjusted based on the context consumer. That's why we have this very special get input markup thing, and we're passing the properties down. If I were to rewrite this again, I mean, in due time, it's not broken, so it should be fine. I don't particularly like this pattern here, because you have to jam it into the render method. I know with hooks you can do something like this. You can use like use context, the use context hook, and I think it's something like this. You can do that within your render method or your stateless functional component, whatever. I think that's fine. I don't know when we're gonna jump onto hooks and so on, but the pattern I prefer is the one that you would see, like the higher order wrapper that you would see within Redux or so on, where if I had I'm gonna say new choice. Yeah, that's fun. Let's pretend it's a stateless functional component for now. Why not? So as you're about to export it, export default. I would like to do this. What did I call it? Choice context. I'd prefer to do this. And then within this with context wrapper, it would basically do this part and then pass in that to that. So within this component, you get a combination of own props, which are the props that it receives when you instantiate it, and also the context props. And now you're able to do whatever it is you want with it. I'd prefer this, but I know that this is in React 16 with hooks and stuff. This is basically a wrapper. Things that wrap to like do something else. They want to kind of step away from that, which is why hooks and stuff were created, which is nice. But I mean, at the moment, I prefer something like this. It's easier for me to rationalize how the data is flowing, and also gives me a clearer way to kind of like manipulate it or do some sort of interception or remapping. with other mechanisms. Anyway, context stuff. Very hot topic right now. So now if I check out choice group context, let's see what this is. Why we need to do this to begin with. Oh, nothing is happening. Okay. So the provider lives in a component called choice group. Choice group is used when you need to render multiple choice components, be it checkboxes or radios, together. And that is the thing that controls whether you can select multi-select, or singular, that being radios. Radio group. Right. Because, I mean, we saw radios and checkboxes, they use the same component internally, which is choice, but they have to behave very differently. And choice group is the guy that will figure that out and pass in those specific properties to the children via context, like so. So this choice group thing, this is a whole, it's not that bad, but there are some things I would like to refactor. Like this multi-select thing, this one could be better. And I'm noticing a bit of child mapping here, which is just a symptom of like our older way or starting way of doing HSDS React things, where before this whole prop connect thing that's become available to us, we had to map through children to do certain stuff. So yeah, I would refactor this a bit, but overall, what choice group is basically some sort of provider parent controlling mechanism that can manipulate child choice components, providing it with some sort of multi-select mechanism where that differentiates whether it's a radio or a checkbox to handle multi-select. And also, this is also a controlled component, as you can see. We have selected values, which it keeps internally in state. Unless you update it with values, then it does some things to add and remove values, which in turn can handle the adding and removing of values that you've engaged with in the UI, being selecting multiple things. And that is it. Very complicated mechanisms using context, unique ID generation. What else going on in here? Context, unique ID generation, mapping and enhancing of properties to feed from the parent component to the child component to eventually the input, uniquely handling how inputs and labels kind of work with each other to give you a native HTML experience. And what was the other thing? There's more. There was a little bit more, I think, to what I talked about today. That might be it. That might be it. Oh yeah, I talked a little about text and how important it is to always render text in some sort of HSDS text-based component to keep your text uniform. The use of visually hidden for accessibility and having mechanisms like that built into these low-level components so that folks who are consuming it don't have to think about it anymore, which is nice. And the principle of having controlled components, like so, where they track some sort of internal state, but the user is able to change it at their whim, to take and by passing it a value and also some sort of on-change handler. And with that, the component relinquishes the control to the user to handle the values upon some sort of user action. And with that, we have our internal choice component and also choice group, which makes up checkbox and also radio, which can be used to build larger pieces of UI like radio card, which looks like this, which is really nice, like so. And that's it for today's deep dive. Hopefully you found this helpful. You've been wonderful. I've been Q, and I hope you have a fantastic day. Take it easy. Bye.